Hi, I'm Phobos and you are watching A Game to Remember. Today I want to dive right into the realm of horror games. In episode 1 I talked about Diablo, the Butcher and the overall scary atmosphere this game portrayed. At the time there were little to no horror games whatsoever, and of course there were survival horror prototypes like Alone in the Dark, but no one of us knew about these games, so they came and went. With that in mind, Resident Evil was the first real horror game that most of us played. Although we were familiar with games like Doom or said Diablo, there was still a huge difference in tense atmosphere, at least as far as I'm concerned. Never have I been this scared in any game before. For the first time the player seemed to be in a somewhat realistic horror scenario. And of course, Doom was scary and it provided lots of different jump scares and had an awesome atmosphere. But speaking from personal experience, even as a kid I was able to distinguish between a fantasy futuristic world and a more realistic one. And boy, Resident Evil provided the realistic horror experience in full force. You only had little ammunition, little means to heal yourself, you died pretty fast in comparison to other games of its time, and pretty much everything in the mansion tried to kill you. For today's episode I decided to go with the very original version of the game. That's not saying that I am not aware of the director's cut version or the GameCube remake, but I want to talk about these versions on a separate episode. And now, without further ado, let's talk about my first experiences in the world of survival horror. Enjoy! Resident Evil was one of the first true horror games of its time and basically scared the shit out of everyone who played it, regardless of age.
Resident Evil.
I remember this game like yesterday. Before getting a hand on it, there were numerous rumors about it. I talked about crazy and made up stories in relation to Link's Awakening last time, and now imagine taking that and multiply it by 100 and you have the batshit crazy stories that everyone was talking about. Interestingly enough, only very few people played the game at the time. In 1996, most of my friends neither had a PlayStation nor the corresponding PC version. Most of us reside with the Nintendo consoles like the SNES, or some of us already with the N64. The PlayStation was this new contender that everyone heard about but no one ever had the chance to play, probably because of the high price point as well. With all that in mind, there's bound to be crazy stories all around the schoolyard. Remember people saying, the more you try to forbid something, the more kids are attracted to it? That's pretty much how it was. Every kid knew about Resident Evil, and that it is the scariest and most brutal game ever made and so on. What of all this hearsay is true? Nobody knew, but I can tell you for a fact that everyone wanted to get a hold of a PlayStation and Resident Evil right then and there. At the time my brother and I owned an N64 which our parents gifted to us not that long ago. With all the buzz around the PlayStation games however, my brother decided to trade in the N64 for the new pretty much unknown Sony PlayStation. You can't believe how angry our parents were at the time because they were fond of Nintendo and still remembered us saying we want a Super Nintendo instead of the old Sega Genesis. But well, nothing of this happened. My brother got a hold of the console and the first game we actually played was Tekken, which was one of the first 3D beat'em ups out there. We knew of Virtua Fighter, but this was way better. A new generation of gaming was born. Now with the new console at hand, of course we wanted to get Resident Evil as soon as possible. Again, the good old video store came to our rescue, because no retail store actually had the game. Until today, I don't know why that is, but you know, it's Germany. Getting games here is always kind of a hustle. I remember seeing the cover for the first time. I guess that guy is supposed to be Chris. But you can't really tell since his facial expression is somewhat weird. I didn't realize until some time later, but right behind Chris were two giant spiders close to him, and now tell me you're not afraid of that. Another thing that most kids talked about in relation to Resident Evil were the controls. People were complaining left and right about it, that they were too complicated and so on, and they were not even able to explain why they didn't like them. But remember, games with rendered backgrounds were pretty much new and nobody ever played a game like this before, so pretty much everyone sucked at the game in the beginning, but with lots of years of experience, nowadays controls are as easy as ever. But during our first playthroughs we would get mauled by zombies because we were not able to move properly. Speaking of zombies, the very few friends of mine who played the game prior to us always used to talk about them. I don't want to go into details here, but one of my friends actually said that he pissed his pants playing Resident Evil. I'm not kidding. So if it is that bad, how are we supposed to deal with it? Now I've been talking about a lot of stories leading up to the moment where my brother and I would actually play the game for ourselves. Interestingly enough, my brother wanted me to play. If you have siblings and you are the younger brother, you probably know about the situation. Back then, when the game was one player only, the oldest brother would play while the other ones watched. If he would go game over, you would change players. Like I already said, both of us knew about the horrifying rumors, so before we could actually start the game, it went back and forth who would be player 1 and who player 2. Eventually my brother decided to play first, and he picked Chris. Little did we know that this is actually the hardest way to start off the game, since he has only 6 item slots and no handgun whatsoever. While exploring the mansion, you eventually came across your first zombie. Holy shit, without exaggerating, both of us screamed while the zombie actually turned its head and looked straight at us. Look at the eyes of this thing. And tell me it doesn't make you feel uncomfortable. It's horrifying. Especially for a kid who doesn't expect anything like this. Speaking of zombies, we expected something like Beetlejuice, but not that. That first zombie was on a whole other level though. We were already terrified by the dogs in the intro, but now living corpses as well? Not a good sign indeed. After your encounter, you returned to the main hall, received your handgun, and then it was pretty much up to you where you wanted to go first. Both of us had no clue whatsoever. We only knew that there are zombies, zombie dogs and other monsters who wanted to come after us. Personally, that's also the reason why I always liked the older games more than the newer ones. You constantly felt threatened. Something that was truly lost since Resident Evil 4 introduced its new kind of playstyle. On your way through the mansion you would eventually find members of the Lost Bravo team, most of them already dead. The encounter with Forrest on the balcony, however, is one that haunted me forever, since the text says he was pecked to death. And right after that you get swamped by birds, just great. There's also a puzzle in a particular room that you had to solve where you could clearly see birds watching you. They did not come to attack you, but with the scene on the balcony in mind, you can't believe how scared I've been in that room. And who doesn't remember the first person pursuit moments in Resident Evil? After you finished off Plant 42 and returned to the mansion, your progress would be interrupted by the sequence. Obviously something was following you and it was moving fast. What could it be? That's when you were introduced to the hunters, nasty motherfuckers. And now you would truly have to pay attention to your health because these walking reptiles didn't fuck around. There was also another similar moment later on in the game when a zombie was going down the stairs and you would see its hand on the door handle. This room was also well known among Resident Evil fans since it provided one of many jump scares in the game. The zombie coming out of the closet was a scary thing indeed, but the real horror was to be found in the diary. I tell you, nowadays there are only little games left which can frighten the shit out of you solely by text messages. Back in the day, Resident Evil did an awesome job by placing reports or diaries of people who worked for Umbrella all over the mansion. Reading about the slow and painful demise of the security guard and the transition of him into one of the living dead is truly a game moment to remember. Itchy and tasty were the last words written into his diary. At this point, I really felt extremely nervous and was on the brink to quitting the game. And now, the most memorable room ever, and everybody, and I really mean everybody who is remotely familiar with the original Resident Evil remembers this corridor in particular. I swear to God, it's been over 15 years and these stupid zombie dogs still get me with their jump scares. Everyone that I've talked to about Resident Evil back in the day referred to this room as being the scariest shit in video game history, and rightfully so. The Cerberus dogs were really tough as well, and I remember that I actually died there for the first time. Funny thing is that both of my brother and I refused to play the game anymore after we witnessed the scene. So after the weekend we didn't touch the game until eventually the director's cut version came along a year or so later. Still, we were hooked by the atmosphere, and personally, Resident Evil is still one of my favorite franchises of all time. We truly cared about the story and characters, and my friends and I used to talk about the story and everything related to Resident Evil for years to come, even though the dialogues were mostly just plain ridiculous. But that's another story. And that's all I got for you today. Thank you very much for watching this episode of A Game to Remember. If you want to stick around, make sure to subscribe to this channel, and if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to press the like button as well. As always, it's really much appreciated, and I will see you guys on Wednesday. Take care, have a good one, and goodbye.